Right, welcome everyone. Welcome to the Healing the Hurt Forum. We're really excited to be hosting this forum today. My name's Claire Ryan and I'm the team leader of the Clinical Practice Development team with Take Two. I'll be moderating the day, so I'm kind of like your hostess for the day. I'll be escorting people through the 4 sessions and introducing our range of speakers to you as we go through the day. So the whole purpose of this forum is really aimed at bringing people together to talk about working with infants, children and young people and their families when they've experienced trauma, and to explore what some of the key elements of trauma-informed practice are with this particular cohort of kids. Take Two is a leading organisation in terms of trauma interventions with children, particularly kids who are involved in the child protection and out-of-home care sectors. So we're really pleased to have the opportunity to share some of our practice knowledge with everyone today, and to, I guess, give you some opportunities to hear about the way Take Two practices in terms of trauma-informed practice and some of the complexities of that, but also to give you some considerations for practice at the end of each session to take away with you. So I'm aware that some people will be here for all 4 sessions today, and other people will have just registered for a single session or maybe 1 or 2 out of the 4 sessions. So we hope that whichever session you're joining, you find this forum really thought-provoking. These sessions are being recorded, so just please be aware that we are recording the entirety of each session. We aren't, though, recording the chat thread, so that won't be included in the recording, just so that you're aware of that. And the purpose of that recording is so that we can make this forum available publicly in the future for people who haven't been able to join us today. I do just want to let people know that there are case materials presented throughout today, and that those case materials are all de-identified, or they are cases that are kind of made up of an amalgam of client experiences. So we're not presenting cases that will easily be identifiable to anyone. All of the images in our presentations are stock images as well. So if we could just move to the next slide, please, Sandra. I do just want to start today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands that we're all meeting on today. I personally am here on Boonwurrung country, but I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands that people are joining from today, and pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging. We recognise the strength and resilience of all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So for the first session today, we've got our first 2 speakers are Marell Lynch and Sandra Radovini. And perhaps Sandra, if you just move to the next slide. Marell Lynch is a clinical manager with Take Two's Western Division, and she's been with Take Two since its inception. So she is a font of knowledge about Take Two practice and the cohort of infants, kids and young people that we work with in Take Two. Marell's a social worker, a psychologist, a family therapist and a psychotherapist, so she's very, very well qualified. And Associate Professor Sandra Radovini is speaking along with Marell, and Sandra is the Director of the Mindful Centre for Training and Research in Developmental Health, and Mindful is a key partner in the Take Two consortium. Sandra is a child psychiatrist. Okay, so we're going to start this session with a bit of a Zoom poll. So Jessamy, my colleague Jessamy House is going to be sort of hosting the mechanics behind the scenes of these things. So if people can just take 30 seconds or so to just quickly answer this poll, it's really just to get a sense of who's in the room with us today, where you're from, what your sort of background and discipline is. So if you can just click on that, that would be great. And the results, you can see the results come up live as we go. And I think there's 4 questions in this poll. Yeah. And just while people are finishing doing that, just to let you know that depending on what sort of view you like to have on your Zoom screen, you can click on the sort of top right, there's a little view options icon at the top of your Zoom screen. You can pick on that and either sort of, you know, see the gallery view or just see the presenter view. Also, just to let people know that we'll be keeping everyone muted throughout the session, and we'll also, we'd prefer people to actually leave their cameras off throughout the session as well. The other thing that I haven't mentioned actually is that throughout the session, my kind of primary role, I suppose, is to keep an eye on the chat thread. So we really encourage people throughout each of the sessions today to put questions or comments into the chat thread, and my lovely team, Jessamy and Jen Willis, will both be keeping a really close eye on that chat thread, and they will sort of feed through particular questions that seem to be common questions or common themes. They'll send those through to me, and in mostly the latter part of each session, I'll be able to put some of those questions or comments and themes to the presenters for them to comment on and have some discussion about. So we really want these sessions to be a sort of conversation between you guys out there and our presenters to help all of you, I guess, get a stronger sense of how we view practice with kids who have experienced abuse and neglect in particular, as well as other types of traumas. All right, I reckon everyone's had a chance to do that poll.
Yeah, we have 100% response rate, Claire,
Oh,
so I'll share that now.
Thank you, Jessamy. Okay, so we've got, Melbourne. Oh, we've got quite a chunk from New South Wales. Welcome, New South Wales. That's very exciting. No internationals. All right, lovely. And then we've got lots of education. I can see 44% from education, 24% from non-government, CSOs, etc., and 14% from mental health, and 9% from child protection. Great to have some child protection here. I'm very appreciative that for a lot of people, it's really hard to take time away from your actual operational work. And Stacey from Catholic Care, welcome from Tasmania. All right, and we've got 32% social workers, 18% psychologists, 28% teachers, some youth workers, which is great, a bit of a chunk of others, and then just a sprinkle of doctors and OTs and speechies. Okay, and 34% of people have got 3 to 10 years experience, great, and then about a quarter of the people have got less than 3 years, 23% 10 to 20 years, and then 20% more than 20 years. Fabulous. So we've got the whole range. That's terrific. Thank you, everyone. All right, I'm going to hand over to Marell and Sandra.
Thank you very much, Claire and Jessamy. Just getting our little screen going. So yes, welcome everybody. It is terrific to have so many people join us, and terrific to have a sense of that spread of experience and backgrounds that I think will make for a very rich conversation amongst us. Marell and I have the honour of kicking off, and our task is really to set the scene. And we are going to focus this first session on 2 words that are recurring words when we think about young people, children, families in out-of-home care. And these words are vulnerability and complexity. And we're going to unpack these words a bit and see if there are some things that you take away from this that might be helpful in your work or indeed resonate with you. So here we go, Marell. Oops. Now, what do we mean by vulnerability? This word comes up over and over and over again in my now long career, and Marell, your long career. It's often a word that is used to describe children, young people, families. And we're going to, oh, sorry, I'm having trouble with my mouse. Here we go. Marell, the next thing is, what do we mean by trauma? So over to you, Marell.
Okay, thank you, Sandra. I'm glad we started with vulnerability, actually. The term trauma originated in the 1690s, and it meant a wound, a hurt, a defeat. And in the 1890s was used to describe the sense of a psychic wound and the unpleasant experience which causes abnormal distress. It's important to note trauma is not a diagnosis, but an event or series of events that results in painful feelings, memories, thoughts, and physical responses to a deeply distressing or disturbing event. For me, in my work, I find there are 4 types of trauma responses. There's the acute response to a single incident, such as a car accident; chronic, which is repeated and prolonged exposure, seen in family violence; complex, which is exposure to varied and multiple traumatic events, often of an invasive and personal nature. So looking at family violence, homelessness, sexual, physical abuse, or neglect from many players. And then we have developmental. Here we have chronic and complex traumatic experiences for the child within their own family and home. These experiences impact on all stages of development, such as regulatory capacity, cognition, speech, physical growth, and movement. The impacts can manifest in multiple ways: developmental disorders such as attention deficit or hyperactivity, fetal alcohol syndrome, speech and language and learning difficulties, and mental health disorders, anxiety, depression, oppositional defiance, addiction, self-harming behaviours. For all these children, and I need to say, when I talk about children, I'm also meaning infants, children and young people, there are relational struggles where there is an inability to trust, find comfort, intimacy, or safety in key relationships. These are the young people who are avoidant of social interactions, cannot read the social language, can be seen as aggressive, risk-taking, behaviourally challenging. These young people have inappropriate peer relationships and are easily exploited, often sexually, using alcohol or drugs as a means to avoid these painful feelings. These infants, children, and young people have lost any sense of self-worth from their experiences with adults. It's not safe for them to trust that they will be protected, and to relate is potentially life-threatening. The child is deprived of their own identity and ability to experience joy in life. It is critical to recognise and acknowledge how traumatic experiences are felt and seen in behaviours and relationships between generations in families and within culture, so that patterns are not repeated and healing can begin. Sandra, I think we then have the wonderful slide on numbers.
Sure, Marell. And the comments, the introduction that Marell has given, of course, will be later in the day. There will be the case discussions that will bring it to life a bit more. So, Marell, over to you.
Okay, I was fascinated by this slide. Sandra, thank you very much. The data tells the stories for many of the infants, children, young people, and families that we see. There is a trajectory for many of the young people: respite care, then supports within the home, then kith and kin, then foster care and multiple placements, residential care, and support to move to independent living and leaving care on their 18th birthday. There are changes in court orders, as well as attempted reunifications to families. Histories get lost, and inaccurate information often follows the child and the family. There is cumulative family disadvantage for these young people as they experience health issues, mental health concerns, drug and alcohol dependency, transience, family violence, minimal education, unemployment, often into the legal system, disconnection, social isolation, and exclusion. And these are the same experience of their parents and grandparents who often grew up in out-of-home care. We have a culture of blame. The parent did or did not do such. With this blame, there can be no trust of professionals. There is a balance between not minimising the harm and not demonising the parent. One thing we as professionals often overlook is that biological parents remain important to the child in an ongoing way, and on leaving care, the young person will seek them out, often to check the truth of what had happened. Sandra, I just want to make this comment, and I may be inaccurate about this slide, but I was looking, it says this data is for out-of-home care. In fact, the numbers are high, but they don't here, I think, include the children in families that are under the care of child protection who are living with family or kith and kin within family preservation or intensive family services interventions. So it's a lot higher numbers. What we know heals is early integrated interventions like Stronger Families, where family members are actively engaged to change patterns of behaviour and sustain positive relationships. Thank you, Sandra.
Thanks, Marell. So first of all, I want to acknowledge Susan Webster, who is an academic at Melbourne University, who provided these statistics, and they are hot off the press. They haven't been published yet. And she is comparing what is the information that we have about the population of children in out-of-home care compared to the Australian population, the general population, let's say, against a range of things. So the point of this slide is not the detail, but the difference. If you look at these figures versus these figures, and I'm wondering in your work, wherever you work, whether you can have a think about, is any of this surprising? Is it stuff indeed you already know? I think the bit that surprised me that I really hadn't taken into account, I hadn't taken into account this question of dental, of the number of children in out-of-home care where this is an issue. I hadn't really taken into account the asthma and other respiratory difficulties, but it's quite staggering. And if we progress to the next slide, where we're looking at the developmental or emotional or cognitive, again, there's a number of you from education, and I think you will know this well, the number of children with speech and language difficulties of the children in out-of-home care. And again, what is the impact on learning? The number of children who have significant behavioural or emotional or mental health, diagnosable mental health conditions we mean here. And of course, here we are, this group compared to this group. What is this about? I think some of it is about the missed opportunities to follow up on things when you have multiple caregivers, when you don't have a consistent primary caregiver, a parent who follows things through, when, as Marell already suggested, children move, young people move from one set of carers to another set of carers to another set of carers, and the thread that is about their physical health, their mental health, things do not get followed up. And I think the other thing is, you know, intellectual disability compared to the general population. So this is giving us at a population level a sense of there is a lot that is going on potentially for the children that we meet, when the only thing we need to know is that they are a child in out-of-home care, and it should raise some flags for all of us around these various issues. Now, what do we mean by complexity? We talk about complexity in the work, we talk about complexity in the problems, we talk about complexity in the presentations, we talk about complexity in the needs of children in out-of-home care. And what Marell and I will do is we have picked a couple of frameworks, models, analogies to see if, to share with you, to see if this might help with the way that you think about things in this area. It is, these models help me when I am struggling with how to understand things. So the first one is complexity is like solving a Rubik's Cube. Now, when Marell and I were talking about this, Marell said, oh, I love Rubik's Cubes. I said, oh, I hate Rubik's Cubes. They drive me nuts. I really, really am no good at solving a Rubik's Cube. So I don't even know why I picked this. But there you go, Marell. But I do know why I picked the Rubik's Cube. And I think it is the difference for me between, sometimes we think about it as a jigsaw puzzle, a two-dimensional, flat, I can see it all. If I'm the person doing the jigsaw puzzle, I can see the areas that I've sorted, I can see the gaps that are missing, I can see the pieces over there. And even if someone assists me in doing a very complex jigsaw puzzle, it is all on one surface. It is possible for us both, or three of us, or five of us, to look at the same thing. When you compare that to a Rubik's Cube, and I like to think that each facet of the Rubik's Cube is a different perspective. The child or young person in the yellow having particular wants and hopes and dreams and priorities, the family's perspective in the green, and again, the same, wanting things to be different, better, coming from an education perspective, again, wanting all of those things to line up, the trauma services, the mental health services, and there's always the other, the unknown. If you've ever tried to do a Rubik's Cube, really, you can only look at one side at a time. It is not possible to see six sides. And as I think about the mental health problems, every time I make a turn of the Rubik's Cube and I try and line something else up to make the blue side a bit bluer, a bit better looking from my perspective, I don't know what is happening the other five sides. I don't know if I'm helping the other five sides line up, or in fact, if I'm making something worse. And the only way, if this analogy fits for you, the only way that we can solve a Rubik's Cube is indeed being able to talk about the facet that we are most interacting with, the bit of the work that we do to try and think about how do we line these things up, and sometimes what's the priority, or what's a good enough? A good enough blue, enough white, enough yellow, enough green. So that's one model. Maybe it works for me because I really struggle with Rubik's Cube, and sometimes that is the sense of the work, the struggle to try and work out what is going to be most helpful, which turn. The next is Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory. Forget about the man's name. It took me several goes to practice it. Bronfenbrenner's. Now, again, the point of sharing this with you is not the detail, but the overall schema, the overall framework, where we start with a child. Again, it may be familiar to you. So, and Bronfenbrenner also, importantly, was talking about child development, ordinary, if I can put it that way. He was not thinking about children in out-of-home care, because the picture gets a lot more complicated. So we start with the child. And Bronfenbrenner said, well, there is what is immediately, those immediate interactions around the child, which usually is school, family, peers. Now, if we have an out-of-home care lens on this, then already we've complicated it. We've got carers, workers, maybe child protection workers, a range of other people immediately come into this mesosystem, a microsystem, sorry, that is what Bronfenbrenner called it. The next level, the mesosystem, he said, well, it's not only the people who interact with the child directly, but it is how those bits of the microsystem interact with each other. So what happens between the family and the school? What happens between the biological family and carers? What happens between child protection and family, child protection and work? You know, all of these different combinations and permutations, how they interact with each other also has an impact on the child, for better or for worse. And he kept going. He said, well, then after that, there's this whole raft of potential services that gather around this child, these carers, this family, this school. that also have an impact. And look at those arrows. They are bi-directional. It's not just directed in, as I said, in one direction towards what is it that will assist or happen to the child. It goes in both directions. And we need to locate ourselves in this bullseye, if you like. Where are we? Now, for me, of course, I have sat in the health system, the mental health system. Those of you who sit in the school system or social services more broadly, but there are other things. What about neighbourhoods? What about the media and now social media? What about politics? What about the family's workplace or not? What if there are those stresses and strains that are about not working? That has this as the complexity inherent in all of these moving parts. And then more so, the macro system that is not about this child, but this time or this community, and what are the cultural attitudes, the ideologies, the socioeconomic status, the ethnicity. How does that play into how this child, this family is perceived, and the stresses and strains? And then, just to, if that wasn't complicated enough, things happen that again complicate matters. And the thing, of course, this year is the pandemic. What has this done to all of us, and how we work and how we live and these interactions? So again, don't worry about the detail, but think about, where are you in your work? Where is your system? Which system do you belong to or mainly interact in? What are sometimes the stresses and strains on you, the individual? What are the stresses and strains on that system? And again, during the pandemic, we have heard a lot about the stresses and strains on our health system, on our mental health system, on education, on family violence. Like, there's nowhere that has not been impacted by what has happened, unless, of course, you have been one of these fortunate souls and you have been in Western Australia, or you've been in Tasmania, and in there, well, life would appear to be as if the pandemic did not occur. So, Marell, the next one is over to you.
I'm dreaming of my planned holiday to WA. Okay. I don't know whether people know about the parable of the blind people looking and trying to work out what the creature is. Sandra loves this one. So here we are. We have a complex situation. We have a distressed child, and everyone is worried and everyone wants to help. So all the members of the system grab onto whatever they can hold, because it's such a complex problem. We can't grab it all as one person. Carers are exhausted because the child struggles to sleep and wakes with nightmares. So then the child is falling asleep in class. The school are concerned about absenteeism. Trauma services see the history of chronic neglect and abuse. Mental health see the behaviour as situational or transient. So when we look back at this elephant, it actually represents the whole system of the child and how we all need to work together. It's not about the parts, but everyone putting the pieces together. And we need to acknowledge that we are only one piece of that puzzle. Sandra, you might want to add to that slide.
Sure. So the quote on the top comes from a colleague of mine who says, every complex problem has a solution that is simple, clear, and wrong. And it is because it is hard to sit with the fact that we may not know, we may not see. There is not clarity of what's the problem or what's the solution. And it is really only when we come together to go, I see this, I know this, I am concerned about this, that we bring clarity. And of course, again, the difficulty with that is that we have to sit with uncertainty. We have to sit with the tensions that may arise when it's one part of the system is going, no, but it's the tree, and we need to attend to the tree, and this is what, or else everything will fall over. And someone else is going, no, 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 no. It's a rope. It's a rope that we've got that we're trying to grapple with. And can't everybody see that? How do we come together? How do we listen to each other and then try and build this picture and sit with tensions, sit with not knowing, sit with uncertainty, sit with disagreement respectfully? That is the tricky bit. Now, again, if I can get my little cursor to go. Now, the next one, this is something that is a way that I think about things when, particularly as a mental health clinician, I am tasked with often, what is there a mental health problem? What is the mental health problem? How do we understand behaviour? How do we figure out what it is that we should do? And the very first thing that we need to remind ourselves always is beware the lens through which you view things. Your lens will colour how you view something and what you think the course of action should be. And it is helpful to me to pause, to go, yes, indeed, mine is medical/psychiatric lens, and to think about what else is going on here. Now, when we think about children in out-of-home care, with those stats that I presented earlier from Sue Webster and from what Marell has already told you, there is always a history of trauma. I haven't yet met or heard of a young person that take 2C where that is not part of the picture. Those stats tell us there are likely to be medical and psychiatric problems. There is sometimes a child with an intellectual disability. There are often neurodevelopmental problems. Think that statistic about language difficulty, learning difficulty. And when I pause, I ask myself the question, where in this overlapping set of circles is the child or the young person in question? Where are they? And if there is a problem when we are used to working in one area, that we struggle to see other parts of this. So, we interpret, and I'll talk about, for myself, potentially, I will interpret things through a mental health lens. And I have to actually consciously ask myself the question, could there be a neurodevelopmental problem here that has existed all along? What is the impact of trauma that we know about? Could this child have an intellectual disability? Because we have to do our best not to miss things. And it's actually quite complicated because the same behaviour can be viewed in a number of ways. So for this child, what is the best way of understanding it? So this is very much part of my work, but I think it is part of all of your work to, again, think about the problem. And sometimes you need to gather the people around you to go, so who has what piece of information? How can we put this together? Okay, over to you, Marell.
I was just going to say, Sandra, I really like that slide because one of the challenges is with intake to how you ensure that everyone has an understanding of the 4 areas and also across the age domains. I'm sitting here thinking about cases that I've seen whereby you've got the kid who's tapping or moving their fingers, etc. And I'm thinking ASD, but a clinician's thinking trauma. And I'm saying it can be both, because if you've got a kid with ASD, they're experiencing trauma in a traumatic family, their symptoms are going to look even more unusual. So the importance to actually hold everything. My slide.
Sorry, Marell, I've gone back, but just to pick up on what you said. So is the child sitting here? What you're seeing is absolutely related to trauma. Is the child sitting here? The interplay between potentially ASD and trauma here. Is the child sitting here? Trauma, ASD, and medical and psychiatric problems. And again, doing that conscious exercise of have we ruled in and have we ruled out? And again, bearing in mind that in this population of children, things are missed over and over and over again. As workers change, carers change, there is no continuity. Recommendations are made that don't get followed through. The child moves, they move home, they move schools, they move neighbourhoods, they move professionals, and hence this is particularly pertinent for this group.
And Sandra, I would just butt in.
Please.
Sorry, do you mind going back to that slide again, Sandra?
Oh, lovely.
What came to mind for me when you were talking through this was that I think, particularly when we work in a sort of highly stressed and under-resourced system, often people are really pulled to say, no, I don't think it sits in my bucket. I think it sits in this other bucket. It's not mental health, it's behaviours related to trauma, or no, it's not trauma behaviour, it's clearly autism. And, because my trauma service, we're over full, so we don't want to have to deal with this constant demand, so we'd rather just put it in another bucket. And I think that's something we all need to grapple with as well, is how much of our lens is influenced by the sort of pressures around us, the systemic pressures.
And as you do the interventions, presentations will change. I've always had a fantasy of take two sitting with mental health, sitting with neurodevelopment, et cetera, so you can actually review and say, well, we've been doing this with a kid and now we're noting that, and they're in a stable placement. So what are we actually looking at now? And Sandra, you're absolutely right. Assessments get done or lost, and then you don't have an integrated look at the child, and then you don't have a platform from then to do a review and say, we're actually moving more into mental health or more into a developmental disorder.
Yeah. Hang on a tick. I'm just going to jump back a bit. So, Claire.
We've taken off.
Yeah. No, Claire, you. I think you highlight the stresses and strains. Back to Bronfenbrenner's. We're in there. We're part of that circle. And the stresses and strains on us as individuals, the stresses and strains on our services and our sectors. And I don't know that people just want to push away for the sake of pushing away. People are like, no, I can't deal with this. No, this requires other people. And the answer to both those things is yes. And no, sorry, Marell, just to finish my thought, no one sector can, and yes, other people have to be there. So, I think that's an important point. Thank you, Claire. Marell.
You've taken off on this slide. The thing for me is when I'm supervising someone, I say, I think it may be this, and they'll pause, and I can see that they are struggling to be able to think about how to explain this to the care team, but more importantly, how to explain it to the carer and the family. So how are they going to take on the information that we may think the child has significant speech and language or cognition, etc. So that ability in the worker to actually say, I need to change the lens that I'm using, and I need guidance as to how to explore it back with the family, with the care team. Now I'm going to shut up about that slide and move on to the next one.
Sure thing. And remember, every complex problem has a solution that is simple, clear, and wrong. We would love it to be simple. Our politicians and governments love simple solutions, but that's not the work that we do. Marell.
This slide set me off. I looked at it and Sandra said to me, because I said, it's much more messier than that. And Sandra said, hang on, think about a child who is distressed in the normal population. What happens? Well, the parent will seek help with the child, for the child and for themselves from a professional or professional team. But within the out-of-home care population, we have distressed children. They can be infants, children, or young people, families, carers, workers, systems, legal systems. Don't get me started on legal systems at the moment. So we've got the child, thinking about the family, we've got the child, the parents, multiple partners, often multiple complex multi-generational family units. I was saying to one of the people in the office yesterday that when my work intake too, the number of times I've worked with uncle and aunties or grandparents or great-grandparents I have been struck by, as opposed to when I've worked in the mental health services. And the particular worker said, yeah, something she'd noted. Then we've got foster carers. Well, then we've got the respite carers. You might have a couple of set of respite carers. And then you've got residential workers who actually also will be working rostered shift and across different units. And then you get the kids who are sometimes put into contingency units so they can get moved around, residential TRC, TFM. So we've got changes so these people, key who they are living with, they may change as the child moves through this system. We talked about the system before in the earlier slide. I feel so sorry for case managers because often overloaded. They're meeting with care teams. They're trying to balance the needs of the parents to be part of the care teams. They're looking at transport, access, support to carers, presentation in court. It's really overloaded. Yeah. And often the child as a client becomes, and I'm using this language because I think it's important language, often the child as a client becomes unallocated and without a case manager. And I often think it means they don't have a parent to advocate. It's a bit like the other word, which is leaving care. They often refer to kids exiting at the age of 18. Then we have contested hearings, and due to COVID, the contested hearings are getting even more heated, and we get sudden changes in care arrangements. The number of kids I've seen just returned home from court, changes to access, orders restricting contact. We get children's court clinic recommendations, juvenile justice orders. So that whole legal system is also causing chaos because we want to go this way therapeutically. I've got the system saying, no, I've got to go that way. Or you've got to overhaul your whole plan. You've got to look at the relationship with dad who's just got out of jail as a sex offender. And then we've got specialist services for the child and the parent. And that may be parents, it may be NDIS services. There might be court conditions on the parent to attend drug and alcohol services or financial counselling. Of course, the parent will have their own history. So you've got multiple different services around there. Where do you find the lens? And then we've got referrals to trauma and mental health services for intake assessments. So you've really got multiple moving players across the child's world at a time when we need to sit with the complexity, anxiety, and tension as one system. Thank you, Sandra. It's your slide next.
Sure, Marell. I'm aware of time, so we're going to kind of get through the last couple of slides. So this collaboration is hard, folks. It's much easier to think that, oh, we need to learn more, we need more skills, we need more therapies, it doesn't matter which sector we're from, we need to have, different ways of intervening with the child. And I think it's important to understand that collaboration is the work, is a very, very important part of the work. And it too requires resourcing, it requires time, it requires acknowledgement that it is the work. It requires a coming together and sitting with the tension that Marell has. Oh, bless you, whoever it is that is sneezing. Now, some questions we might ask ourselves, and Marell and I will run through these relatively quickly. Marell, you get the first one.
I hope it's yellow. Okay, so who needs to be at the table and how do we include all voices? we need to give thought to who actually needs to be there. I'm thinking about care team meetings, professional meetings. What is the purpose of the meeting? Who has that piece of information that we need? Who has the influence, the agency? And how do we ensure these meetings are not tokenistic? Sandra, it's orange, yes.
Yep. Sometimes we ask ourselves, why are we stuck? What's missing? Is there something I don't know about? And there can be many a time that there are things that we don't know, can't know, or won't know. And how do we make decisions when there are pieces that are missing? Marell.
Okay, for this, we need to be, I cannot stress, we need to be curious and we need to be respectful. We need to listen with an understanding that there will be different version of each person's experience, and we need to acknowledge the intergenerational and cultural patterns. I think I'm red. Yep.
Yep. So,
okay.
Hang on, Marell, my turn.
Oh, good.
So I think an important question, given what we've said about the importance of everybody coming together, is how do I best take a collaborative stance? How do I walk alongside my colleagues, the professionals, and with the family and with the child or young person? Marell.
Okay, so depending on the context, we might change the setting. We might do psychoed to the whole of school around a series of presentations they may have similar to the child that's been referred. We might.
Oh, Marell, you're muted. I'm not sure what's happened, but there you are, you're back.
We might do, as I said, work with the school. We might do dyadic work with a carer and a child, looking at regulatory play. We might do a game of peekaboo with a parent and a child. We might support the worker around the child having the first access with the dad in prison. So we're always child-centred and thinking about how to reduce the distress for the child and those who are caring for the child.
And that applies, it doesn't matter what part, what sector you're in, sometimes to rethink what we're doing and how we're doing it. But this, I think, is also important. How do we create safety and invite honest feedback about what is and isn't working? Now, I think this is actually really tricky but key to collaborative work. Do we talk to our colleagues about the things that are working? Do we congratulate people that the child and the young person is getting to school, is managing to stay at school, is managing not to lose it as much as they had previously, and celebrate those wins? And then the flip side, how do we listen when someone is telling us that something is not working? How do we listen and think about it together? How do we not feel blamed or judged? How do we not get defensive? I think this is the skill in the work. All right, last one for you.
I'm thinking about the workers. I might feel tired, overwhelmed by the outcome of that previous court case and despair about change. I may feel sad, too saddened by the stories that I've heard and cease listening with compassion. Or I might see the child and the family in the same light as my last client and feel hope as the care team works so collaboratively together.
Beautiful.
And I have a wider knowledge of interventions to work with the families that I'm actually looking forward to my next supervision session.
That's great, Marell.
Thank you.
Yeah. We are some considerations of practice. Now, we're not going to go through all of these because we've said them. They're just there as a reminder. But Marell, you want to pick out the one in the middle.
The one, being aware of and managing our own responses and emotional response to complexity and risk. So I think we need to acknowledge we've got a collective concern for infants, children, young parents and families, and this does impact on how we listen, feel and respond to the complex situations. These impacts are bidirectional, as our emotional responses then tell us about the child and the family. It's critical. We need appropriate spaces to share our feelings and speak of the impact on us. To support these vulnerable, complex families, we need processes that support the work and recognise and intervene in secondary trauma. To begin, we need supervision, support, interagency agreements, collaborative and reflective practice, and curiosity, a willingness to listen, and above all, hope. Over to you, Sandra.
Thank you. And fragile, please handle with care. The young people, the children, parents, carers, and all of us. We too need to be held with care and thought about with care. So thank you all for your attention. We hope that this gives you some things to mull over as for the rest of the day you hear about some of the cases that our colleagues will be presenting. Thank you very much. Now I'm going to stop share. We bring us back.
All right.
Now, Claire, you might, I know we've taken a bit of time in our setting the scene, but if there are some things that jump out at you that you want to pick up on, please do. Well, Marell and I will do our best.
Well done. Yeah, thank you. There were a few questions that popped up in the chat thread, and particularly around the sort of the Venn diagram with the 4 intersecting lenses.
Yep.
And 2 of the questions are really quite similar in terms of if you've got a kid with an intellectual disability and a history of trauma, where do you start? Do you start with the disability or the trauma?
Oh,
yeah.
Yeah.
And can you answer that in 10 seconds?
Yep. Now, which bit of the elephant have I got?
Yeah.
I think the point of it is that you hold in mind, or you try and hold in mind, all of those possibilities. And as you go along gathering information, because that is what we do, we gather information, we are trying to see, where does the information fit? You know, which of those buckets, if you like, does the information fit? And also, one of the important things is not just information that is cross-sectional, not just now, but longitudinal, gathering information that is longitudinal. I cannot stress enough the importance of taking time to thoroughly gather the information. And then you are weighing things up and you are asking yourself, is it and or is it or? And I think in this population, it is and over and over and over again. Remember, every complex problem has a solution that is simple, clear, and wrong. If you think you've only got one thing going on, look again, would be what I'd be saying. And gather round the people that you need to answer those questions. It doesn't mean you have to do it all yourself. Thanks.
Yeah. And I think that was Leanne's question, just to sort of further drill down to that, Leanne, that there kind of is no answer about where to start, because it is all about the sort of, you have to decide where to start. There is no kind of right answer.
Yeah, think about any other kind of complex puzzle. You start wherever you are, and you hold in mind that there may be lots more going on that you don't know about.
Yeah. We had a question from Megan about a kid who has a history of trauma and also is presenting with, with ASD and or ADHD, which is, very common in our cohort of kids. And the question was, can the ADHD and or ASD symptoms kind of be, I guess, as a result of the trauma that the child, without the trauma, they wouldn't necessarily have developed?
Okay. Yep. I get the question. Thanks, Claire. Actually, this is a question that is asked quite commonly. And it is, how do we understand symptoms? How do we interpret the behavior that we see, and how do we interpret it longitudinally and also with all the bits of information? So if we take one of those things, let's say we take the question of inattention, a child that is not attending. Is it because they are hyper aroused? Is it because they are anxious? Is it because they have ADHD and they're hardwired? The wiring is they are inattentive. Is it because they have ASD and actually they're not interested in the thing that you want them to be interested in? And what we do is we build pictures in order to get the kind of picture, that would look like ASD. Then we would have to be saying the trauma, the neglect is extreme. We would have to be saying it is something like the Romanian orphanages. It is that kind of, and sadly, we sometimes do meet children who have had those extreme experiences. And then we are also looking at not just one set of symptoms, but what about repeated interests and activities? What about sensory sensitivities? What about, so you are doing this pattern recognition. And if indeed you have, well, I can't pull this apart, then you go, well, let us have a period of intervention that will look at what would be helpful in trauma and backgrounds. Let's look at stability. Let's look at consistent care. Let's look at a nurturing environment. Does it change some of these things? So I would say, in my experience, most of the time, gathering everybody around the table, you can figure out whether it's and or, and some of the time you are left with, actually, we're not sure, and time will tell.
I was going to say that I've been struck by the number of young children and young people who are with intake 2 who do have ASD. And when you're looking at it, you're thinking about this child, or he may have had ASD in utero, been born into a family of adversity. So those unusual behaviours become even more unusual and more narrowed down and refined. And they're a way that the child actually avoids not only the social interaction, but also avoids the lack of interaction from parents or the abuse that's occurring within the family. So it's sort of like putting multi-layers on. And so when I start to see these kids with there's a little bit of, it's like the little bell goes off. You think, I wonder if this kid's got ASD. I go to what Sandra says. I think about getting all the assessments done, but what can be done to calm, to regulate, to settle, so that then we can be precise about what we're looking at and then build the appropriate interventions. So the number of kids that I've seen with people going, oh, definitely not ASD. I'm going, I think they're ASD, but sensory, regulatory, calming, watching the patterns, reversing the triggers, educating the parents, preparing them for that potential diagnosis. And then you see very clearly the child does have ASD or ADHD or FASD. And we know when we're getting the referrals for our young people, we're saying very clearly, we want to have every assessment that's been done. We don't want to waste time getting another assessment.
Yeah, thanks, Marell, because indeed our colleagues who do sensory profiles, our colleagues who do speech and language assessments, they will give us important information. And I see in the chat somebody
Coventry grid.
Coventry grid.
Yeah, love it. Love it.
Indeed. That helps us. It helps us look at things. But back to, in this circumstance, in this population, overwhelmingly, it is likely to be and rather than or. Claire, can we fit one more in?
Oh, I reckon that's it. It's 10:30 on the dot. I did just want to highlight one comment from Michelle, which I thought was a lovely comment to finish on, actually, which was going back to the Rubiks Cube analogy, which people loved. And Michelle's comment was that it's really important to recognise that the child's side of that Rubiks Cube, that it's really important to create a space for the child's views and the child's priorities to be heard, because often, there's a high likelihood that the child's what's important to the child will be quite different to what the system thinks is important. So it's, yeah, I thought that was such a lovely point.
Yeah. It's why that's the first one. The yellow on my list, it's the first one. Children, young people have wishes, needs, priorities, and we need to try and understand those as well as everything else that everyone else is trying to do to affect a good outcome. Thank you, everybody, so much. I hope
Thank you, everyone.
Fabulous day. And I'm sure there'll be lots more meat on the bones, so to speak.
There will be indeed. Yeah, thank you, Marell, and thank you, Sandra, very much. I know that the appreciative comments have been flooding in through the chat thread. So for those people who are staying on for the next session, you know, and if there are people who weren't planning on staying but are now thinking maybe I will, you're very welcome to. There's no problem. We've got, you know, plenty of capacity. So people are very welcome to stay. It's just the same link for each session. And we'll have a break now. So, you know, go and look after yourselves, go and make a cuppa, and we'll come back for the next presentation starting at 11 o'clock.